Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to the WSU Community Engagement Institute's Rising to the Challenge workshop series. My name is Joyce McEwen-Crane, and I work in organizational and strategic development here at the Institute. And I'm joined today by your facilitators, Drs. Tara Gregory and Sarah Jolly, who are back by popular demand, I must say. But we're also joined with our colleague, Mary Montgomery, who will be helping me run things behind the scenes for your webinar today. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to do something in the chat if that's helpful, or you can email us at the original workshop invite email, and we'd be happy to help you out. The purpose of the Community Engagement Institute at Wichita State University is to collaborate with our partners to facilitate learning, develop innovative solutions, promote equity, and build capacity to create real change. Our ultimate hope is to see vibrant communities and dynamic organizations that are supported, connected, and effective in making progress. So you're here at the second workshop in our 6-part workshop series. And this session is about an interesting and relevant topic called Telling Your Program Story Through a Logic Model. We've been overwhelmed, I think, happily by the response to this workshop series and specifically to this talk. And we're really thankful for your support, both to our long-term friends and partners and to those of you who are new to us. Thanks for being here for this part of our series. Right now, I'm going to talk briefly about the purpose of the workshop series, and then I'll cover a few Zoom housekeeping items, and then I'll hand the workshop over to Tara and Sarah. And given that we only have an hour, we'll be moving fairly quickly, but you'll have some opportunity to work in the chat and ask some questions and stuff as we go along. So this series is really about how we rise together in the face of challenges. And we at CEI want to let you know that we're here as a resource to you and as an interested community partner for you at all times, and especially when you and your teams may need extra support and sense making. And our hope is that here today we can learn from each other and with each other. We're also here to challenge some of our assumptions and habits around how we do things and how we work together, maybe even around how we communicate effectively about our programs or not, and also to connect with one another in really meaningful ways. So let me cover just a few housekeeping items on Zoom, and then we will launch into our talk. I know we're all, or at least most of us, should be really familiar with Zoom by now, but just in case you need some reminders, we will keep you muted during the talk, but you should feel able to unmute when you need to ask a question or you want to make a comment. I don't think we'll have breakout rooms today, if I remember right, from Sarah and Tara. So we will not have breakout room times. The chat is available to you at all times during this talk. So please feel free to throw your ideas, your comments, perspectives. Please don't be shy about using the chat box. And that being said, if it becomes overwhelming that things are rolling through the chat box really fast and it's distracting, then close the chat box. Just don't look at that for a while until we ask you to put your ideas and comments into the chat box. We really do love to have your cameras on during the talk. We love to see you. It does bring a lot more energy to the talk and helps us feel more connected with you, and also helps us kind of read our audience a little bit better. So please try to have your camera on if that's possible for you. You might also use the rename function in the top right corner of your pictures frame. That way we can call you by name, and that's also really helpful. And then we are recording today. You should have had to have clicked on the got it little box. We're recording it so that the replay can be sent out to people who want to watch it again. And so we'll try to make that available to you in the next 2 weeks along with the slides. So today your facilitators are Dr. Tara Gregory and Dr. Sarah Jolly, and I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll also put a link in the chat with their bio if you want to learn more about them. So I'll hand it over to Tara.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and we're happy to see everyone here. I think we'll get into this a little bit more later, but you'll see that Sarah and I are maybe 2 of a dozen people in the world who love logic models. And so this is a topic that we find kind of fun to talk about. And we really hope by the end of this that you'll gain at least, some appreciation for logic models, maybe not as much as we have, but that's kind of our job. So I'm the director of the Center for Applied Research and Evaluation at the Community Engagement Institute. And I've been here a little over 16 years now. And so, the work we do, Joyce said previously that part of what CEI does is helping organizations with sense making. We definitely fit into that role of helping organizations identify needs of those they serve, identify whether they're making a difference for those they serve, and really anything related to making sense of data and input and that kind of thing. So that's our center, and we're always happy to help. And doing a logic model is a big part of figuring out the needs of the people you serve, as well as figuring out whether you're meeting those needs. So with that, I'll let Sarah introduce herself.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Jolly, and I am the evaluation coordinator at the Center for Applied Research and Evaluation here at Wichita State University's Community Engagement Institute. As Tara mentioned, we love logic models. We enjoy talking about logic models, teaching organizations about logic models, helping organizations develop logic models. We just think they're so much fun. And you don't have to think they're so much fun. It's okay. But hopefully, as Tara mentioned, you're able to learn a little bit about them through our time together this afternoon. I've been working at Wichita State for almost 20 years now. It'll be 20 years in February, which I can hardly believe. But I'm excited to join you all this afternoon.
All right, thank you. Okay, so what we're doing today, and again, to people who know or have tried to do a logic model, the idea of storytelling may seem a little bit odd and disconnected, but that's basically what logic models are. Is they're just a way to tell your program's story. So we're going to start with talking about the importance of telling a story. Many of you understand that numbers don't cut it a lot of times, but telling a story of what you do may be the thing that makes a difference. We'll look at how logic models tell your story and the connection between those two things that don't really seem like they fit. We'll focus probably most of the time on applying the elements of a logic model and figuring out what piece of the story the different elements tell, and then spending a little bit of time helping you figure out how to present your story in a logic model. So those are the things we're going to go through today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah and get started on telling a story.
Okay, so I'm going to start us out with the importance of telling a story. So when we were kids, we probably all heard the story of stone soup. So on our next slide, you'll just see some pictures that sort of go along with that. But so we're all pretty familiar with the story of stone soup. So I'll just sum it up really quickly in case it's not fresh in your brain. There are 3 soldiers who are traveling home. It's been days-long journey. They haven't had much to eat. They come upon a village where it seems like that's the best place for them to stop over for the night. They're very hungry. They would really appreciate something to eat. But the village, they don't know these soldiers, and they're a little suspicious. So everybody's a little standoffish. They say they don't really have anything for them to eat. And so the soldiers say, that's okay, we will make stone soup. So they slowly ask for things like a large pot, some water, they ask for some fire, and then they ask for 3 large stones. And so they pull all of this together. And as they're boiling this water with stones in it, they start saying things like, oh, it'd be great if we had some salt and pepper, or it'd be great if we had some carrots or some cabbage or some potatoes. And slowly people are like, oh, well, I have some carrots. And they come to the pot with what they have. And so as they build this soup together, I did want to read just a brief passage. So Everyone has brought something to the pot now. And at last the soup was ready. All of you shall see, the soldiers said, but first a table must be set. Great tables were placed in the square, and all around were lighted torches. Such a soup! How good it smelled, truly fit for a king. But then the peasants asked themselves, would not such a soup require bread and a roast and cider? Soon a banquet was spread and everyone sat down to eat. Never had there been such a feast. Never had the peasants tasted such soup, and fancy, made from stones. They ate and drank and ate and drank, and after that they danced. They danced and sang far into the night. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So as we think about how that story played out, so these soldiers come to town, no one has anything to offer them, and slowly they're able to sort of build this soup, and as a result, everyone eats together. They have a feast as a village that they've never had before, and they sing and dance and eat and drink into the night. So as you think about this story, and you guys can either, if you feel comfortable unmuting, I know Carrie mentioned she has broadband issues. That happens to all of us at times. So sometimes audio might not be great. If you feel more comfortable in the chat, that's totally fine. But when you think about just this story of stone soup, who are the main characters of the story? So who is this story about? And again, you can toss it in the chat if you wanna. Our office is slightly loud. Yes, that happens as well. So feel free to drop in the chat. Who are some of the main characters? The villagers. Villagers are one of the main characters. The soldiers. Those are sort of our two groups of characters that are involved in this story. And what is the main action? When you think about the story, what happens during this story? So what is the action? And then what are the resources that contribute to that action? Watch in the chat. Sharing resources. Yes, so the main action is making the soup, right? So that's the main thing that happens during this story. They make a soup. It's a problem solved. The soldiers are hungry and they come up with a solution that involves engaging the villagers. And how do we know? What is the evidence that something actually happened? So if we wanted to say what the success of this evening was, what are the things we could count? What are the things that we could say are evidence that something happened? So yes, exactly that, Stephanie. So the soup itself, the number of bowls of soup, the meals that folks were able to eat. And then how did this impact the main characters? So you mentioned the soldiers and the peasants. When you think about these folks, what happened to them? So immediately, so what happened right away? And what are maybe some things that would happen in the future as a result of this event? Trust, that would be a really good long-term thing, right? So this event, this time, helped build trust. Exactly. So they were able to eat. The immediate result was people had soup to eat. And long-term, larger scale, they built trust with one another. There was a sense of community that resulted in that night, in the end of that night. So let's see as we move on to the next slide. So why do you need to tell a story? So organizations tend to get really focused on what they do, like the things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes we're not great at communicating what we're doing or why exactly we're doing it. So when you tell a good story, it helps people connect with the people that you serve. It helps them better understand why the work you do matters and why other people should care about the work that you do. It helps, as Tara mentioned, what a lot of the work of our center is helping people be able to accurately describe what difference their work makes. And we just know as humans, we are built for connection around stories. Stories connect us to one another, and stories carry more emotional weight than things like numbers and statistics and things like that. I am not saying that numbers do not matter. Those are also very important. So don't lose me. Don't lose me on that point. Numbers also matter, and stories also help add a layer of connection to the numbers that you might be providing. So I'm going to turn it to Tara for this next portion, and she's going to start talking about how logic models can help tell your story.
Yes, I forgot to mention one thing about me is I have a noisy dog under my feet right now, and if she decides to start barking, you'll know it, and I'll have to handle that. But for right now, she's quiet, and so hopefully she'll stay quiet. The noisiest one is outside, so hopefully we have the dogs handled today. So Sarah told the story of Stone Soup. And she kind of walked you through kind of who's involved, what happened to them, what actions took place. And if you go ahead and advance the slide, I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the parallels between that story and the things you identified and a logic model. Because as we said, the elements of the logic model are really just pieces of a story. And if you can kind of distance yourself from, I mean, I know one of the things about logic models is people get overwhelmed by, I've got to fill in a grid and I've got to do it exactly right. And I don't understand what the difference between short and long-term outcomes are and those kinds of things. But if you think about it in terms of a story and how a story evolves and the different elements, it makes creating a logic model feel a little more organic and meaningful. And so the parallels here are when you look at a logic model, the person served or the target audience, that's basically your main characters. Who are you doing something for, or who is this about? And we'll get into this a little bit more, but there can be two levels of this. So there's the direct audience. Those are the people who are actually receiving whatever it is you do. So if you are doing a parenting program, the direct audience or the direct main characters, the main characters are the parents because they're the ones that you're interacting with and you're doing something for. The indirect audience are kind of who else is going to benefit from this. So parenting programs exist because you want kids to do well. And so the indirect audience there would be the kids. And in the Stone Soup story, well, you know, like the soldiers would be the main characters. They're the direct audience that, you know, ostensibly the soup was made so that the soldiers could get something to eat. But indirectly, a lot of other people were impacted as well. So the activities are basically what's the main action taking place during the story. What's the thing that you're doing that makes a difference or that impacts those persons served? So in this story, very simply, the action was making soup. Okay, that's all it was about. It was making soup. So if you distance all of the other pieces from the story and all you focus on is the action or the activities, you're missing a big part of it. It's a really important piece, but that was why Sarah said earlier that sometimes programs get really focused on, you know, but we did these things for these people. Well, that's only part of it. It's important that you did that action, but there's a lot more to the story. So as part of the activity, you know, Sarah talked a lot about how did you prove that something really happened? What did you count? So part of that were your inputs. So what resources were used to make it happen? In this case, it was carrots, it was meat, it was, you know, the stones, the water, you know, the pot. So those are the things that you use to make it happen, or the things that you need to make it happen. Your outputs are the things that we count so that we know that something happened. And this is a really important piece for funders, because funders want to know, if they give you money, what did you do with it? It doesn't mean that you really made a difference. It just says you did something. So that's the number of bowls eaten. not the number of bowls eaten, the number of bowls of soup eaten. We hope that people were just eating the soup. But the number of bowls served, the number of people who showed up, that kind of thing. Again, those outputs don't really say that a difference was made. We don't know whether, that really solved the problem of hunger, or whether that really brought people together just by counting what we did. But outcomes are where that piece comes in. So what's the impact? What difference did it make? And so again, the difference between outputs and outcomes are, outputs is just counting stuff to say, yep, I did something. Outcomes are, did I make a difference? And so again, Sarah kind of talked through what were the short-term outcomes. Well, people got fed, they weren't hungry. That was the main, short-term outcome. When you get into the longer, intermediate and long-term outcomes, what could you see happening later? What happens on a larger scale? And so if you think of it in terms of a story, it's kind of like dominoes of, we do this, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and it builds from there. And so when you're trying to describe to a funder how your activities have made a difference, you normally start with, this is the immediate thing that's going to happen. We increased knowledge, we changed attitudes, we taught people some skills. And then from there, the next thing that happens is, well, they changed their behaviors. They're doing better about managing their budget. They're not using substances now. They're doing better at some of these parenting tasks. And then long-term, that a lot of times is more on kind of a community scale. Well, we've reduced hunger and food insecurity in the community. We've decreased child abuse rates. We've decreased substance abuse rates. And so again, when you think about telling the story, you talk about, these are the people that we were focused on. These are the things we did for them. And this is how we know we did it, because we used these inputs and got these outputs. And then the outcomes were, this immediate thing happened, which led to this thing, which led to this thing that impacted the whole community or impacted people for a long time. And so again, it's really telling that story. And if you can think about it in terms of, kind of that sequence of events and what is happening because we did something, that makes a logic model make more sense. And I think it's easier to create. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. So hopefully you can see the connections between, the stone soup story and how we kind of break it down. And even something like that's a kid's story, we can put it into a logic model. Only Sarah and I would ever think of doing that, but you can do it. So I look forward to reading more books and mapping them out in logic models. But for today, we're going to stick with that one. So anyway, when you look at a logic model, you typically see some version of what's on the screen right now. So it's your statement about who you serve, what you're using, what resources you're using. So the inputs that you have or that you need, the activities and the outputs that come from those activities. So again, it's what you do and the tangible products that you can count. So it's typically things like, we're conducting workshops. How many workshops did we do? How many people showed up? We delivered this service. How many people received it? How many staff were involved? All of these other things. So again, it's just, what did we do? How were we proving that we did it? And then short-term outcomes tend to be increase or improvements in knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, skills, and individual conditions. So when you think about how people start to make changes, it tends to start with, I need to know that there's a better way. I need to believe in a better way or a new practice. I need to kind of try it out and develop some skills. And so again, that's why those short-term outcomes are connected quite frequently to increase in knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs. In the Stone Soup story, you saw that initially the people in that town were like, we don't have anything for you. So their attitudes were, no, we don't know these people, we're not going to help. But that first outcome was them going, oh, okay, maybe we can contribute something. Maybe they're okay. And so that attitude of maybe they're okay had to come before them actually bringing out the carrots and the meat and that kind of thing. So the intermediate outcomes were really the changes in actions and behaviors. So that's where, again, if you link it back, sorry, I kind of keep switching between Stone Soup and actual programs. But for example, if you're doing, I see Chad in here. So if you're doing a substance abuse prevention program, you'd want people to gain knowledge and change their attitudes and that kinds of thing, those kinds of things about using substances. And then the next thing that you would hope to see is that their behavior would change, or it would solidify current behaviors. And then long-term, the changes in the more community and social conditions is what you would hope to see. We'll talk a little bit more later, but sometimes measuring the long-term outcomes is difficult. And this is where the idea behind the logic model is that there's a logical link between what you do and these long-term outcomes. So you may not be able to measure your impact on substance abuse rates in the community or obesity in the community, but if you've lined out your logic model logically, you can make that logical leap to say, because we impacted these short-term outcomes, because we impacted these intermediate outcomes, we have contributed to these long-term outcomes, and therefore we can say we've helped make things better. Okay. And somebody feel free to put questions in the chat or just stop and say your question. I'm always happy to stop and answer questions. So, okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So just kind of to sum it up, a logic model, and the reason why we like logic models and the reason that we feel like they get kind of an unfair reputation for being, too difficult, overly daunting, that kind of thing, is that they're basically just a way to tell a story of how your program works. Again, linking your activities logically to the desired outcomes. They're helpful in planning. You can do a logic model before you implement something so that you can make sure that if you want to see a particular outcome, that the activities you're planning are logically linked. Sometimes we help organizations do evaluations, and when we start doing a logic model, we can see that the activities that they were doing maybe aren't really well linked with the outcomes they want. And so it's a good thing when you're planning to do a logic model, but also if you're already implementing a program, a logic model is a great way to determine what kinds of things do we need to be measuring. Do we really have things lined up appropriately? And again, overall, they're just a good way to tell your story, and they're frequently required by funders. And one of the reasons that funders want to see them is that it's a snapshot of what you're doing to help funders understand what the potential is for you to really make a difference, and to help them understand what difference you're trying to make. And so it's not just another form that funders require. It really is, they're hoping to understand your program in basically one sheet, in a way that maybe all the narrative wouldn't help them with. So yeah, we think logic models are pretty important. And with that, I think, Sarah, are you up or am I? Yes.
I'm going to take over for a minute.
Okay.
I'm gonna take over for a minute. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about applying the elements of a logic model. So Tara went through each of those and kind of provided an overview. And you can go to the next slide, Mary, that's fine. And I'm going to go over each of these in just a little bit more detail. So you saw Tara cover sort of the key components, key elements of a logic model. And these are pretty standard across the board. Sometimes they might be called something else. So you can see that inputs are sometimes referred to as resources, but these are largely the elements that you'll see from logic model to logic model. So we'll start with looking at persons served. So if we go to the next slide, persons served refers, again, if we're thinking about the story element, who are the main characters? So the group of people that you are trying to impact, or the group of people that you're dealing with directly. And the better you are able to talk about them, the more specifically you're able to talk about them, the better it is for you. So Tara is in charge of all of our pop culture references. So I am going to give an example from a TV show that I have never watched before, but lots of people did. So when you think about characters from your favorite shows or movies, even if it's just one or two people, a lot of times they represent a specific type of person. So the show that I've never watched is Game of Thrones, but lots of people have watched Game of Thrones. So for example, when you think about the Starks, they represent a group of people who are trying to do the right thing in a really tough world. So they were really wealthy, but now they're struggling. They've been separated. They've had issues. They're encountering difficulty. Or if you think about a more lighthearted show like the Great British Baking Show, Tara also loves this show. They're really skilled people who are trying to win a competition and overcome difficult obstacles. So the more you can kind of personalize the people that you're serving, the more you can personalize them to your funders, to your stakeholders, to others, the better that can be. You can see some examples there. So when you think about people you serve, the answer is typically not everybody. That's not typically the answer. So think about things like age. Think about things like geography, any qualifying experiences. So you can see veterans, that's a qualifying experience, or first generation college students, that would be a qualifying experience. So the more specifically you can think about the people that you serve, the more beneficial it will be for those who are trying to understand the work of your program and the work that your organization is trying to do. So on our next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit more. You heard Tara mention the difference between direct and indirect persons served, and both of these groups are important. So direct, those are the people who are most central to your story. So you heard Tara talk about a parenting program. Parents are typically the direct service recipients. In our story of Stone Soup, the direct people, the direct persons served included the peasants or the villagers and the soldiers. They were the ones who were directly involved in what was happening in the story. And then when you think about indirect persons served, those are people who may not be directly involved, but they stand to benefit from what happens with your organization or with your programs. So for a parenting program, you heard Tara mention indirect population that benefits from parenting programs is ideally children. And when you think about the Stone Soup story, some indirect beneficiaries of that night might be any future visitors who come to town. So they learned that the soldiers were trustworthy individuals, and they could ultimately welcome them in. Perhaps that will remain going forward, and any future visitors might feel more welcome than the soldiers did initially. It may also, you all mentioned building trust. It could be that they just have a greater sense of community going forward. So those are just some examples of thinking through direct and indirect when you think about persons served. So on our next slide, we'll talk. So, you watched all those boxes fill on the logic model. So that first box was persons served, and then we moved to activities. And again, this is where's the action? What action is happening? So just like with most stories, there's a lot of action that occurs around the main characters of the story. So they may be struggling with health issues. They may have family difficulties. They may be fighting for something in the community. But the actions that you take to help them are the activities that you should be talking about in your logic model. So what support are you giving them? Any education you're providing to them? Are there policies that you're trying to change that will help them? So you can see some examples of different activities that might be included in a logic model. So those are the types of activities. So again, actions, what's happening? Where is the action in your story? So as we talk about activities and go to the next slide, activities will help people visualize what it is that your program actually does. And then another quick note is that you do want to make sure your activities are directly connected to your outcomes and that people can see that. You can probably think of a story or an example where something was maybe ruined or maybe went off track a little bit because something unrelated got thrown in for some reason. Another Game of Thrones example, apparently Ed Sheeran showed up in an episode of Game of Thrones and people got super upset about it because it didn't seem to connect or have anything to do with the story. I do know who Ed Sheeran is, but I didn't know he was on Game of Thrones, but apparently people weren't happy about it. So if your activities do not logically connect to your outputs and your outcomes, you probably shouldn't be doing them. And yes, that's like all of your activities. If they aren't somehow connecting to the outcomes you're trying to achieve, you should think about whether those activities should still be happening. And if they do still need to happen, maybe they don't make sense in this particular program that you're developing a logic model for. So you want those connections to be made so that you're maximizing the use of your resources. So on our next slide, we're moving now from activities. So we've talked about person served, activities, and now we're going to talk about outcomes. So this is what is happening to your main characters. And I think I'm actually supposed to pass this to Tara at this moment. So I am going to let Tara talk to you more about outcomes and what that means for sort of the main characters in your story.
So we keep saying this, and if there's one thing to remember from this is that outputs are not outcomes. So the things you count don't necessarily mean that you've made a difference. And that's a hard thing to get past because, I mean, you know, it's the precursor. So if you're handing out food, if you're doing educational programs, you know, if you're providing beds at a shelter, yes, that's tangible and it's important, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've made the difference that you hope to make. For example, right now I'm saying if there's one thing that you remember, please remember this. Just because I've said it doesn't mean that you'll remember it. And so the output is that, yep, I've said this is the main point. The outcome is, do you remember it and are you able to apply it? That happens a lot with kind of educational programs of, yep, we've put all this information out there. Is anybody using it? Has it made any difference to them? And so the outcomes are, again, what difference has this made? What really happened to the main characters other than receiving a service? So these, like I said earlier, there are specific changes or benefits in attitudes, belief, knowledge, skills, status, or conditions that result from the program activities. And so this is why you want to make sure that your activities and outcomes are really lined up, or potentially you'll get some outcomes that look a little off and are unintended or not really what you had planned on. Your outcomes should be SMART, so specific as possible, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timed. So a lot of times outcomes are written as, you know, on a post-test, 75% of the kids will answer positively about, you know, or that's the wrong way to say it, but 75% of the kids will say that, yes, they believe that, you know, this substance is harmful. And then you would say, you'd need to be able to measure that. Chad could probably tell me 75% maybe off track, but we're using that number for right now. So, I mean, that is one point. Make sure it's realistic, because I've worked with programs in the past. I used to do substance abuse prevention, so that's why I keep going back to that. And I worked with programs that said, we're going to decrease substance use by 75% in the next year. That's not going to happen. Substance use doesn't decrease that quickly. And so it should be more like 3% or 5%, depending on what your issue is. You don't want to try to impress funders by saying, we are going to solve this problem this year. You want to be realistic about it and timed. So we're going to do this within this amount of time. We're going to do this year or within 5 years or whatever. And so that's what the SMART outcomes means. There are 3 types of outcomes. So we've talked about this before. Short term is normally at the individual level. Again, the changes in it, the ones that I focus on most are knowledge, attitudes, belief, and skills. Those are the things that can change most quickly. If I went to a class and somebody showed me how to, cook chicken better, which I'm a horrible cook. And so a lot of progress could be made by going to one class. And I would be able to go back at a certain point if they surveyed me and said, yes, as a result of that class, I can now cook chicken better. My skills have improved because my chicken is edible now. So that's that short-term kind of immediate impact at the individual level. Intermediate could be at individual or group level. So for me, it might be, now I'm able to incorporate chicken into my meals more often, or now I am able to take chicken to potlucks and people aren't worried about it. That's a longer term kind of outcome that shows that I have changed my behavior, not just short term, but I have changed my behavior longer term, or that I'm beginning to impact, or the activity is beginning to impact people at a group level. Long term tends to be at the community level. So have we impacted things like hunger, substance abuse, mental health, parenting, that kind of thing. Sometimes when you're dealing with like individual kind of treatment level kinds of things, like being able to, for example, if it were a substance abuse treatment program, the immediate outcome might be, this person has increased their knowledge of how harmful their substance use is. Intermediate might be, they've been abstinent for 3 months, something like that, their behavior seems to be changing. Longer term would be, have they been abstinent at a year or 2 years or 5 years, whatever would show that this looks like this really has made a difference on a longer term. So you kind of have to calibrate those based on what your program is and what makes sense for you. So we're kind of all over the place with our examples because we're trying to, show that your logic model is specific to your program. And so depending on what the focus of your program is, your outcomes are going to be really different. So, okay, go ahead. So I mentioned a little bit of this earlier, that the long-term outcomes can be really difficult to measure for a program or an agency, because a lot of times you're looking at community level changes. And you're not going to be able to survey the whole community about, did their attitudes about substance abuse change, or are they more likely to use vegetables now? And so, you kind of have to, this is why the logic model is valuable, is because it helps you make that logical connection, given your short-term and intermediate outcomes. So, if we're seeing a reduction in substance abuse, or we're seeing an increase in or a decrease in food deserts or something like that. Probably one program or one organization will not have created that change. But what you can do is link what you've done in terms of your contribution to it. We always say it's contribution, not attribution. So you can't claim credit for decreasing substance abuse in the community, or, you know, making sure that fewer people, or you know, reducing food insecurity in the community, but you can say you contributed to it because your short-term and intermediate outcomes have shown that you've made changes on an individual level. And obviously, if we change the life of individuals, that contributes to change in the community. Okay. So this, I just want to show, we're going to go back to stone soup and show what a logic model would look like for stone soup when you're looking at this outcome level. So if you read across, the short-term outcome is that there was an increase in awareness of the availability of food assistance. So putting it into logic model terms. So people were more aware that, hey, a bunch of people are throwing together food. There are a bunch of people in this community who have some food that they're able to contribute. So intermediate, you have an increase in the number of persons getting adequate nutrition. So again, just increasing awareness doesn't necessarily mean that people are changing their behavior, but more people eating and more people getting adequate nutrition is that intermediate change. And then improved health outcomes in the entire community because more people are getting proper nutrition. That's the long-term outcome. So on another level, there's an increase in awareness of food insecurity and hunger. So because those soldiers came into town, what they may have done is make people aware that, oh my goodness, my neighbor doesn't have anything to contribute. Or, you know, man, there are some people who really needed this soup. So you increased awareness of food insecurity, hunger. There's an increase in number of programs to address food insecurity and hunger because of this increased awareness. Maybe people came together and said, we're going to do this regularly because we now know not enough people have food, the food that they need. And then you have more sustainable efforts to address food insecurity and hunger. And then a very, very kind of different outcome is increase in empathy for others in the community. So maybe people were really kind of like, I don't care what's happening to my neighbors. I'm going to stay at home and take care of myself. But because of the action of putting this soup together, people increase their empathy, increase support for programs to help those who are food insecure or hunger, and then a greater sense of community because people are coming together and going, you know what, I really need to care about other people in the community. So that's kind of how those outcomes flow in an actual logic model. Again, we're using stone soup as the example, but you could substitute a program that's focused on food, and those would be the same outcomes. We evaluate some projects that are related to food insecurity and hunger and that kind of thing, and these would be perfectly good outcomes for those types of programs that actually exist in our communities. So with that, I think I turn it over to Sarah, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think our next slide says that we're going to do breakouts, but don't freak out because we're not going to do breakouts. I know Tara and I, as folks who have a preference for introversion, tend to go, oh, breakouts, I'm out of here. There's only like 12 minutes left. I don't need to do a breakout. We're not doing breakouts. Don't go anywhere. So I do wonder, though, if there's anyone on the call who would be a brave soul willing to sort of just jump in and do just a quick storytelling of their not organization, but of your program. I know a handful of people on the call that I could potentially call on. I won't do that to you. But is there anybody who might be willing to unmute and just do a quick rundown of your person served? So talk a little bit about the main characters of your program, the key actions or activities of the program, and what you kind of see as some immediate outcomes and maybe some long-term outcomes. So we're not asking for anything more than like just a quick rundown. Anyone willing to jump off of mute for just literally a minute, 60 seconds, and tell us a little bit about your program?
I can do it. My name's Sam. I work at HeartSpring. I'm kind of new, so of course I'll jump right in. So I was just going to do, instead of HeartSpring as a whole, I was going to do our pediatric services program. Oh gosh, I just lost my notes. Everything's okay. I'm fine. Okay, who do we serve? We directly serve the children, right? They're working with the children directly. So activity is and outputs would be, they would do therapies. So an output number would be how many therapies they do a month. A short-term outcome would maybe be a kid meeting like a milestone that they missed, like so walking at a certain age. An intermediate outcome could be that kid being put, like for instance, that kid being put in a more rigorous course for academics. And a long-term outcome could be just a more productive workforce. It could be more understanding populace. I mean, you always hear, this is not an official HeartSpring thing, but I mean, a long-term outcome could be less divorce, because there is some divorce in families with kids with special needs and things like that. And I don't have any data to back that up. That's mainly just storytelling that people have told me. So I'm not officially saying that or anything, but it does happen. So, and it can be stressful for families. So maybe that works.
Thank you so much, Sam. Gold star for you. One of the things that I think is great about the story is that you talked about your direct person served, right? The kids are the ones you're serving directly, but you also mentioned some indirect groups. So as you move from your short-term to intermediate to long-term, you mentioned workforce development. So these kids would potentially grow up and be able to contribute more to the workforce. You talked about their families and how maybe the assistance that these children get may help alleviate some stress in the family and in the marriage potentially, but family dynamics might be impacted as well. So thank you so much for being willing to share with us, Sam. And we will move to our next slide because we are going to keep you on time today. I think we'll go ahead and skip this slide, but do think about, some of the questions on there as you think about talking about your logic model and the story that you might tell. You'll notice that when we went through the logic model, you saw all of the columns that Tara laid out. And then when we talked through them, we didn't talk through them in that order. And that's intentional. When Tara and I walk organizations through logic models, we don't do them column by column by column. We always start, well, we don't always start. Sometimes we start with ultimately, like, what is your long-term vision? We sometimes start there, but we really tend to start on who really are the people that you serve. And what is it that you're doing and what do you hope to see happen for them? And so that's typically where we start. So we didn't talk really a lot about inputs. But inputs are things that typically people are pretty aware of. So these are the resources that go towards your program. So when you think about stone soup, these were the contributing elements to the recipe for the soup. So you see the stones, carrots, meat. You can make these as specific as you want. So you can see number of FTE, so number of people you have on staff, how much money you have from different sources, the amount of office space you require. All of these things can be quantified and put into your inputs. So sometimes you can talk about your logic model from a programmatic perspective of where we are currently. This is what we have. And you can also, if you're building a logic model for something you don't have yet, you can build it and talk about what inputs you need or what inputs you would really have, have to have to make that program happen. So inputs, again, tend to be something that people more intuitively understand. Those are things like money, people, and resources that help contribute to the success of your program. Another piece that you might have noticed we skipped over was outputs. So the next slide talks a little bit about outputs. And again, these are the things that are a little bit more intuitive to people. These are the things that you are counting. So from our stone soup example, the number of bowls of soup that were out, the number of people who were able to eat that night. These are the things that you typically count and report out to either funders or on your annual report or in any number of places. So these types of outputs are things that people are ultimately pretty familiar with when you think about what your program is doing, what activities you have going on. And on the next slide, this is stuff that Tara already mentioned, but we really talk about outputs as accountability measures. It doesn't say that what you did necessarily made a difference, but it does say that you did what you said you were going to do. So for funders, that lets them know, hey, you said you were going to do X number of workshops. You did X number of workshops. You said you were going to provide this many meals to kids. You provided this many meals to kids, and they were nutritious. We can also check that box. But outputs are not the same as outcomes. They are necessary, but not sufficient. So the hope is that they are connected to your outcomes and that you have made a case for how these types of activities, how these types of outputs you believe that they lead to the outcomes that you've identified, and potentially you have identified ways that you're going to measure whether those sort of short-term intermediate outcomes are happening as a result of your outputs. But those are just a couple things to note about outputs. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tara to wrap us up here in the last 4 minutes, but how you then present your story back in a logic model format.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just mention about outputs, I know sometimes funders, that's all they ask for. So when you're reporting, all they ask for is tell us how many people you served, how many of these things you did. And so they don't always ask for the outcomes. It's good for you to know because we know you want to make a difference for the people you serve. It's not just about spending the money and getting the numbers. And so it's always good to think through this, even if, a funder doesn't require it, because the value of a logic model, again, is being able to explain to anyone how your program works. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, just to review, this is what your logic model looks like. This is so much more boring than the story you have to tell. And so typically when you're telling your story, you may not include as much detail as you have in your logic model, because like we started, stories tend to kind of, get to the heart of why you're doing something, and they're much more engaging. But if you can think in terms of the elements that are in a logic model and figure out a way to tell that story, this obviously isn't an elevator speech. It may take you a lot longer than a minute or 2 minutes to describe this. But if you're, doing a presentation or something about who you serve, what you do, what difference it makes, your logic model really helps you make sense of that, because you have all of these pieces. And so, it gives people a full and vivid picture of what you're doing. So I think that, again, the value of this is it helps you think it through. It helps you make these logical connections. And so when you do tell your story, it makes sense to people, and they're more likely to support what you do. They're more likely to want to come to you because it's obvious you have this thought out. And again, it makes it easier for you to identify, if you're doing this before you start a program, it makes it easier for you to identify what kinds of activities you should be doing in order to achieve the outcomes you want. If you're doing it after you've started the program, it helps you line things up a little bit better and be more clear about what differences you're really making. And so again, we really think logic models are valuable in and of themselves. But if you approach it from the perspective of, I'm going to tell a story. And again, like Sarah said, a lot of times when we work with programs, we'll start with them just saying, tell us your story. And we fit the elements into the logic model. And at the end of it, they're like, well, we have a logic model. and they didn't realize they were talking through a logic model. They were just telling us why this program matters and who it's for. And so start with that. Just think through your program and what story would you tell people, and then start fitting it into your logic model. Whoops, I just stepped on my dog. So now she's gonna yelp. So, okay, let's go on to the next slide. I think we're, just, because we're evaluators, we want to say this, that the logic model does provide the foundation for evaluation. Your outcomes are usually the most important elements in an evaluation because it tells you that you made a difference. But again, it's important to measure the other elements, and we're not saying that outcomes are the only thing you need to measure. You want to think about the other pieces. And when we do an evaluation for an organization, we do look at all of these pieces. And even if you haven't asked us to, sometimes we'll create a logic model because it helps us understand and do a better job of evaluating, whatever your program is. So, okay, I think we're about at the end here. Just to put in a plug for us, we're always happy to help organizations create logic models. If you have a logic model that you're not sure about and you want us to take a few minutes to look at it and see if you're on track, we're happy to do that. And then again, we primarily exist to do evaluations for organizations to help them identify the needs and whether they're making a difference. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joyce. So thank you all.
Actually, I think we'll hand it to Mary.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. I did put an evaluation link in the chat there, and I'll go ahead and repost it when I'm done talking, just so you can find it easier. And I want to remind everyone that we do have another one of these sessions next week, and it's going to be at 3 o'clock, same time. Joyce, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure it's over navigating conflict and difficult conversations. So with that, thank you all for coming.